Hi, this is Scott Geitler from Blue Water Photo, and today I am going to talk about the exciting new Sony A6300 mirrorless camera. It is one of the top of the line mirrorless cameras, and it falls in between the Micro Four Thirds line and the Sony A7R2 line in terms of sensor size. This has a APS-C size sensor, which is similar to the Nikon D500 or the Nikon D7200, which is a larger sensor than the Micro Four Thirds camera, but not as large as the full frame sensor on the Sony A7 II or the Sony A7R2. It's a really nice camera. Sony came out with the Nex 7 and the Nex 6 and then the A6000, so this follows up on the A6000. Sort of next in line. Let me go over some of the improvements that Sony made in this camera over the Sony A6000. It has 425 phase detection autofocus points, which is a lot of autofocus points, and the autofocus on this camera is really nice. I mean, you just point and click and it takes a shot. It works really well. I used this camera for a few days. Shooting small stuff, large stuff, video, and it's been working great. You have a choice of using the LCD screen or the viewfinder, and the viewfinder here is really sharp, it's really accurate, so it's a nice option if you're shooting in bright light or in the sun, or you just prefer to hold the camera up to your eye if you're used to that as a DSLR shooter. This camera also has some really nice high ISO performance. I was shooting this at ISO 6400, ISO 12600, and the ISO performance was really nice. You can see some test shots in the review that I put online on the Blue Water Photo Store website. The ISO goes all the way up to ISO 51000. So if you're shooting in very low light, this camera is definitely very capable of handling that. Another nice feature of this camera is high-speed shooting. If I change the drive mode to high-speed shooting, it'll shoot in RAW at 10 or 11 frames per second. And it works quite well. I was shooting some moving objects and the autofocus kept tracking them during the continuous focus. So that's a nice feature of this camera. The image quality of this camera is also excellent. I'd say it's definitely comparable to the Nikon crop sensor DSLRs I'm used to shooting with. Dynamic range is excellent, color is excellent, and DxOMark, which does independent sensor testing, gives it very high marks for its sensor rating. So you're not going to have any issues with getting outstanding image quality of this camera. Another nice feature that's added to this camera is 4K video. It shoots 4K video at a very high bit rate of around 100 megabits per second, which is considered professional level video, similar to what you might get in, say, a Panasonic GH4 or a Sony A7R2 or a Canon 5D Mark III. There is a 1.8 crop factor on the video when you're shooting 4K, so which means when you're using a macro lens, it's going to be even more macro, so it's going to be great for macro. Wide angle, not as great unless you're using an ultra wide lens like a fisheye lens, and then you'll get some really nice wide angle. So you just have to keep that in mind if you want to shoot video, that there's going to be a significant crop factor on the lenses, a little bit more than the regular 1.5 crop factor that this camera has. Let's talk about the flash for a moment, especially when it comes to underwater photography. This flash does have some limitations. It does not have any manual flash power setting. So that means when you shoot with the flash, you do have to wait a little bit of time, not much, but there's a short delay when the flash is ready to fire again. So you just have to keep in mind that you can shoot a little faster when you're using electronic C cords with this camera. Also, the sync speed which you can set this to. That's a maximum shutter speed when using the flash, is 1/160th of a second, which is usually not a problem unless you're shooting into the sun, into very bright light, in which case it's not as ideal for getting the sunbursts as, say, a faster sync speed of 1/200th or 1/250th. So that's a slight limitation there. Also on this camera, the battery life is not great. I think you'll get 2 solid dives on this, but you'll probably want to change the camera every 2 dives. So if you're looking for something to last 3 dives or 4 dives without changing it, this may not be the best choice. I want to talk about lens selection for this camera, particularly for underwater. I love fisheye lenses, so actually what I have now on this camera is a very small Sony fisheye conversion lens. It's a really nice wide sharp lens and it's very low priced, and it actually, if you watch here, it actually screws right on to the Sony 16mm f2.8 prime pancake lens. So I have the Sony 16mm prime lens on here, and then you can put the fisheye lens on here. How does that go? And you have a really nice, small, inexpensive fisheye setup. For macro, I really like the Sony 90mm macro lens. And I just want to show you how large this lens is on the camera. It's not huge, but it's not tiny either. So this lens has amazing image quality. So with this lens, you can get amazing photos of small fish and macro subjects with this camera. I'm going to switch this and put the prime lens back on with the fisheye converter. Some other lenses that are also really nice for wide angle, for the pelagics, for sharks, for Galapagos, the Sony 10-18 f4 wide angle lens is great. Zeiss also makes a 12mm f2.8 prime lens, which is a little pricey, but it's an outstanding lens for pool work and marine life portraits. You can get the camera with a 16 to 50mm kit lens, which is a good mid-range lens. And if you get the Nauticam housing, that lens will also work with their wet wide-angle lens, which is a nice, sharp zoom-through wide-angle lens, which we'll cover a little more when we review that housing. Sony also makes a 30mm macro lens, which is a very small, light and sharp and inexpensive lens. It's not the best focal length for macro because you're a little too close to the subjects, but like I said, it's very inexpensive lens to get. I am going to show you a couple of the housings that are out. Nauticam has a housing out, Icolite has a housing out, and Rexy, Fantasy, and Aquatica have all talked about making a housing, although I have not seen any of these housings or got indefinite dates from them yet, so we will see whether these housings actually appear. This is the aluminum Nauticam housing, which I will review separately, but it's a nice, very small housing, very ergonomic. Here's the polycarbonate Icolite housing. It's at a much lower price point, and it's really not that much bigger. I'd say it's slightly bigger. You don't have the same port selection. You have a slightly more limited port selection, and the ergonomics are a little different, but you do have full control over everything in the housing. So stay tuned for some videos sort of going over the details of the Icolite and the Nauticam housing. So overall, I think the Sony A6300 camera is really, really nice for underwater photography. You can do great wide angle, great macro, great video. You can get all that in a very small package. You can also shoot with Canon EFS mount lenses. You can shoot with, there's adapters you can get that will shoot with the Takina fisheye lens, a Canon 8-15 fisheye lens. So you do have a lot of lens options for this camera for shooting on land and underwater. But it's a very good, high quality, general purpose camera in a small package with a couple small limitations. And I should also point out that it doesn't have the large lens selection like the Micro Four Thirds cameras do, but I think the lens selection is more than good enough, and you definitely can notice that increase in image quality from the larger sensor. So overall, I'd rate this camera very highly. If you have any questions about it, about configuring it, about housings, please feel free to email me at Scott, S-C-O-T-T, at bluewaterphotostore.com. And thanks a lot for watching the video.